Hi folks, with Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio no pictures live stream. Please listen to this presentation as you would a radio broadcast. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the issue of remigration from the West. Now, the entire white West, or once white, Western bloc is subject to globalist orchestrated and forced mass migration. All of this done without the consent of the people, indeed in direct defiance of the wishes of the Western people. So there's nothing legitimate about it at all, nothing. And remigration, encouraging these people to go back to where they came from is probably the only possibility now. The numbers that have come in are refusing to integrate or assimilate. You know, the integration rates are minuscule, 1 or 2% maximum. And this means that these people will form effectively, subcultures, sub-nations within the nation, and they'll demand special benefits and handouts. As we can see from the British situation, the British state is now guaranteeing all sorts of protections and support for the Muslim population at the expense of the domestic local population. And this is something I think we'll see all across the world. It's being decided by the globalists that until the white people accept their eradication, and happily and willingly, grovelingly accept their eradication, they must be put in their place and slapped around and told that you don't have legal rights, but these other people do, and so on. So remigration really is in effect the only issue. Now, it's come up in sort of on my radar recently because there was some Indian people who are reasonably cultured Indians. They're not the peasant type, but they're what you'd say would be middle class. India doesn't really have much of a middle class, but anyway, middle class Indian, and they came to Australia to have a better life, and why? Well, India's so corrupt, it's so crowded, it's so dirty, it's so polluted, it's so overpopulated. And we wanted to come to a nice white man's paradise. Why don't you make your own country better? No. We wanted to come to a white country. And I wouldn't rate them as political necessarily. They fancy themselves as morally and spiritually and intellectually, actually, in their case, superior to Australians or to white people generally. And but nonetheless, they make quite a play of if they get cleaners to come in, they want the cleaners to be white, and they like to sort of really play the racial supremacy card, which is interesting. Nonetheless, they've got, both of them ended up working, and they had to import sort of an Indian nanny to look after their children because they couldn't afford to pay the local rates. So they were using an artificially cheap sort of system. So they bring in this Indian peasant woman, and she gets put up in some like through a labour hire firm. She gets put up in some place where they live 20 to a bedroom, and she's the nanny looking after the children. So they only have to pay her sort of $20 a day, whereas if they wanted a nanny full time, they'd have to pay a great deal more. Nonetheless, they both had kind of average wage jobs, which they only got through affirmative action. So they wouldn't have got those jobs, I don't think, without the affirmative action. I'm convinced they wouldn't without the affirmative, both government jobs, by the way. So they've got kind of around the average wage, and both of them, but they sort of say, well, the cost of living is so high in the West, or in Australia in this case, and they're living in Sydney. The cost of living is so high that actually they're no better off. In fact, they would argue worse off in a social prestige sense, worse off than they would be if they stayed in India. And so the income, I think he had, I'm not sure she worked for some friend's business in some bullshit made up job, but he had some job in India where he got paid like $15,000 a year. Now that's quite a lot of money in India, and you can do all right on $15,000 a year, given that the average, the per capita GDP is like $2,000 less. I think it's $1,700 a year. So on $15,000 a year, you're doing okay. and you can afford lots of servants and this sort of thing. And the servants are really getting paid next to nothing. You're giving them food and this clean water to drink. And so there's something these peasants aren't getting this where they live, the slums that they live in. So even just having access to food and this sort of stuff is enough. Anyway, the peasants are so they're going back to India because they can live a better life, and also they can play big note. They can be big tough sort of folks in the local community. They employ all these peasant servants, and so they got people groveling to them, and the people in Australia, the white people, don't grovel to them, and they're rather a little bit annoyed by this. Don't these white Australians realise our sort of moral superiority? I mean, why won't they grovel to us? So there's a bit of that going on there as well. But nonetheless, they're self-remigrating, which is the reason I mention this, because they said, well, really, we're actually worse off here in Australia because of the cost of living. Sure, we can get white man's jobs, and sure, we've got average wage, well, probably a little bit better than the average wage in their case, but the cost of living being what it is, we're worse off. So we're going to go back to India because we'll be better off financially, and we'll be considered as being more prestigious within the community, having all those servants, that sort of thing. Apparently there's bragging rights in India about how many servants do you have? Well, I have 10. Oh, well, I got 20. Oh, you're a real heavy hitter. So the bragging rights on the amount of servants you have is apparently a big deal in India. I didn't realise that. I suppose it makes sense when you think about their caste system. Anyway, given the huge number of Indians that are a part of the mass migration sort of system in the world today, then Indians deciding to remigrate back to India is a big deal, and one that we should encourage at every turn, I think. But let's have a look at remigration attempts in say Scandinavia and places like that, where they're saying to third world peasants, "We'll go back to where you came from, and we'll pay you to go. We'll pay your transport, and we'll give you $10,000, $15,000, which can go a long way in these places. Again, you can live like a king for a couple of years on that sort of money. So, but it doesn't work. I want to stay here and get all the free stuff. Now, certainly everywhere I've heard, and from Indians and third world people as well, well, why would I leave Australia? Look at all the free stuff you provide. I mean, wow. There is a heaven on earth, and it's a first world country where you get all these handouts and all these freebies. I can parasite off the system here forever for the rest of my life, and it'll be way better to what anything I could have got in my home country. So the issue really is removing benefits or limiting benefits. Now, there are multiple pieces of this jigsaw. In the first instance, people from remote rural villages who are illiterate peasants, they don't just decide to up and move one day. You know what? I'll go over to the Western country. They don't even have the sophistication to conceive of distance and time and place. They can't even understand it or comprehend it. So they have to be encouraged. So there's a vast network of globalist stirrers and agitators and people movers, and whether they work for the NGOs or the United Nations is sort of academic. They're all across the refugee camps, all that sort of thing. There's this vast activist network all across the third world, encouraging and enticing, bribing village elders, all sorts of things to get these people, these illiterate, simple, naive, IQ 80 peasants to go from their little village in the middle of nowhere to the Western world. A vast network. Now that needs to be shut down. Once you shut that down, then the push factor is eliminated almost overnight. And this is a very important factor to where it all kicks off, where it all begins. That's the push factor. The push factor, to some extent, I suppose it can be things like regional conflicts and famines, but those parts of the world have had regional conflicts and famines forever. This is not something new to them, and they kind of shrug their shoulders. And if you've got an IQ of 80 and you're an illiterate peasant in the middle of nowhere, you don't think in terms of that middle class lifestyle that I'm missing in downtown Western Sydney. You don't think in those terms. We think in those terms in the West, but they don't, nor can they even comprehend that type of thinking. So they go to refugee camps where they're given free food, water, and then again, the place is shot through with agitators saying, hey, you ought to go to the West, and also filling them full of propaganda, indoctrination. Yeah, you know, the reason you're a poor illiterate peasant in the middle, the reason is because the Whitey stole it all. Otherwise, you'd be living in a mansion on the waterfront with lots of servants. You'd be an important person, a person that's respected in your community. Only Whitey stole it from you, so you need to go to that white country and get all that stuff back because it's yours anyway. And they fill their heads with all this propaganda. Now that once the agitators have stirred these people up and say, okay, off you go, you head over to London or wherever, Sydney, New York, you head over there. Then there's a vast transport infrastructure to move them. So there's an agitator infrastructure. The next stage is the transport infrastructure. How do you think these people cover thousands of miles and arrive with new clothes and all this? How do you think that happens? Because they're given free transport, free food, free clothing, free water, free everything. They're very well looked at. They couldn't make those journeys without all that support and help. Nor could they comprehend. They can't even comprehend distance. These people. The furthest they've ever been from their village is 5 miles down the road. That's it. They can't even comprehend distances and different terrains and climates. It's beyond their comprehension. So there's this vast transport infrastructure. When you look at the way stations from some of these people to get from, say, remote parts of Africa and that to get to, say, Britain, the amount of and these people don't own anything, so they can only make money by working as slaves or women, selling themselves for sexual favors, that sort of stuff. So the entire infrastructure is supported by the NGOs, again, the United Nations and all sorts of other nefarious actors to get them to the West and then deliver them onto the, how do these people in going from France to Britain, how do they afford to buy these rubber? Have you looked at those rubber boats? I mean, the motor, they're not that cheap. The fuel, all that sort of thing. How do they afford all that? And a lot of them arriving with like new trainers and new clothing and so on. How do they afford to renew their passports and all this stuff? Who pays for all that? So there's a vast infrastructure of moving people around the world. Again, it's a globalist thing, and so that needs to be shut down. Now, once you do that, you've cut off the supply, the fresh supply coming in. Then you can issue border issues of border control and all that sort of stuff, and tighten up people that claim to be refugees, because the evidence bar they have to meet to claim to be a refugee is very, very low. And the Western governments put themselves in a position where the onus is on the white people to prove that you're not a refugee, which is close to impossible given the high burden of proof they put themselves under. So anyway, that cuts off that. So now the people that are in the West, but now using Australia as the nearest example to me at least, because there's such a vast affirmative action, race, gender, affirmative action, DEI, and all that sort of stuff in Australia, 95% to 98%, in fact, I'd say 98, 99% of the brown people, black people, the only jobs they have are because of affirmative action or because they're part of some effectively slavery exploitation type thing. The peasants from rural India and China that are put 20 to a 2-bedroom apartment, that sort of thing. Other than that sort of level of exploitation, all the jobs are affirmative, and they'd be working so cheaply. But all the other jobs are affirmative action. I don't think there's a single Indian that I'm aware of. Oh, I mean, there might be the odd one or two who actually has the job, got the job on merit. They've been given through affirmative action. They've been given these jobs, particularly in the public service and the bigger multinational firms where they rely almost exclusively on government, taxpayer revenues and contracts. Then they've been the big movers as well in employing black and brown people. But it's all affirmative action. Whenever I go to meetings, more and more now, the meetings through the business I've shared, more and more now the meetings consist of black and brown, mostly either dark brown or brown people who have no right to be there. They haven't earned that job in any sort of merit. They're utterly incompetent, not even, and by the way, not just incompetent, but they don't give a shit. They're not trying to be better. Sometimes, especially with white people, you can, especially younger white men, this is more the case here, that they've been over promoted, they're in a job they really shouldn't be in, but they're very keen, they're eager, they're bright, they've got a higher intelligence, they're busting their ass to be competent and capable of their job, doing what they are, asking questions. I don't understand this. Can you explain it to me? This sort of, and you know that you're helping someone that really wants to be successful and capable and competent and so on, and who believes they need to be capable and competent to do the best for the company, their fellow workers, and so on. You don't see that attitude ever in the brown and the black people. You just don't see it. They're entitled. It's an entitlement, it's a prestige gig, and nothing more. The idea that they have to do a job, perform a task, that's done with sort of reluctance. Oh, well, if I have to, but they're not there because they want to do it, and they think they're entitled to these jobs that they're given through affirmative action, which makes them even lazier than they otherwise would be. But none of them winning these jobs on merit. So we've got a vast, this massive army, millions of Indians in Australia, for example, none of whom, again, a tiny proportion, have got their job based on any form of merit, and they're oozing with a sense of entitlement. But how many of these people would stay if A, they couldn't get these affirmative action jobs, and B, and more importantly, I think, if they couldn't get handouts and benefits? Most of the Arabs and the Middle Eastern people here would leave straight away if the benefits were cut off. If the Indians couldn't get their affirmative action jobs, or they had to reapply for these jobs based on merit, very few would get the job. Very few would get the jobs. So these are possibilities for encouraging remigration, but self remigration is I think the bigger issue here. Or even saying to people, look, if you want government benefits, you have to go back to your country of origin, and we'll pay you benefits for 3 months or 6. But if you stay, you get no benefits. But we will pay you benefits, but you must go back to your country of origin, this sort of thing. And I think they'd go back straight. The minute you cut the benefits off, bang, the whole base of staying in the West is to parasite off the Western welfare system. And the minute you take that away, then they'd want to go back. And again, the only reason that many Indians stay is because they're being guaranteed employment through affirmative action. You cut that off and they'd want to go. They wouldn't stay. And again, many of them will go back anyway when the cost of living in here exceeds their ability to live the sort of life they think they're entitled to in the West. Now, you could also look at things like universities where just because someone pays this from the third world countries, particularly rich Indian Brahmins, Chinese Communist Party general goons, this sort of thing, where they say, hey, we've paid the $100,000 to attend a university. You got to give us the fucking degree. Do you think we're actually going to work hard and pass the degree? I mean, excuse me. So to say, well, you must pass, and to a higher level of rigor, academic rigor, then again, that the universities would clear out very, very quickly. They only come for the prestige of it. The West is a playground to these people, and they come only for the prestige, not for the academic or intellectual rigor of acquiring a degree through ass-busting hard work. Now, there are also other things, like if any company employs, any business employs an illegal alien, then and there have to be a stringent definition on that, an illegal alien, then they're fined, heavily fined, and that there's a very good chance you'll be caught and fined, and then companies won't employ these people, and also if they send remittances back to their the impoverished village of their ancestors in whatever third world place they came from, then that's taxed heavily. So effectively they get no money, or whatever money that they're making gets taxed heavily in the Western country, but just produce as many financial disincentives for them to stay. And once those disincentives reach a certain point, they'll self-remigrate. They won't want to stay. It won't be worth it. They will only stay if they can exploit the system. They will only stay under those circumstances. And if you cut off the affirmative action jobs, penalties for heavy penalties if illegal aliens are employed, and heavily taxing remittances back, then that'll be it. They'll go. They'll go of their own accord. And I think the remigration along those lines, to encourage them to do it, is the best way for migrants that commit crimes. Third world migrants that commit crimes, the deportation should be it. I notice in Australia they've got no problem deporting white people. In fact, they do it with aggressive eagerness. Someone that may have come from Ireland when they were 15 years old and they're now 50 years old and commit some sort of crime, serious enough, maybe it's drug dealing or something, then they're very keen to expel those people. But when it comes to a brown or black person, we can't. Human rights. Oh, it's human rights. No. Deport. And once there's, because there's a lot of crime from particularly like Somalia and places like that. If the issue is, okay, you commit the crime, you're deported. That's it. Then we'll find that crime will get out. But now there's no penalty for them. They get slap on the wrist. The black person's human rights. So there's a lot of things can be done to encourage and facilitate and support remigration. But it has to be made. It's simply not viable for you to stay here and parasite off the system. You're going to have to go, and that will be the big change, along with the other things that I mentioned in this presentation. You've been Tacitus today. You're a pushback channel. Thank you for listening.